It sounds a little odd to say out loud, but the leader of the country that is at war with Russia, Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is actually trying to get a seat at the negotiating table that's going to bring that war to an end. You wouldn't think that that's a hard thing to do, or that there would be any question about that. You'd think that he would be leading the prospect. He would be leading the negotiations. But the fact is that he is just and right to be trying to get a seat at the table because he doesn't have one right now. The bigger question is, will he even get one besides any kind of just perfunctory face-saving kind of seat, almost like on the back wall of the table that's going on, because evidence shows that so far he's not in the discussion. And I think when you look at it from a realistic geopolitical condition, that he is basically on the outside looking in. And that's not surprising, because really, in many respects, Zelensky has been on the outside from the beginning. I mean, he's been talking from the very start of this war, all these things that he wanted NATO. But first of all, he wanted NATO to come in on the fighting with him. He wanted NATO air superiority. He actually wanted the NATO air forces to come in and provide a shield over his country. And then he started wanting all kinds of other things, tanks and artillery and planes and air defense systems, etc. And all of these things got slow rolled, some of which took years to actually materialize. He was getting a lot of stuff, but he was always talking. Well, now then, we've seen in just the last week or 10 days, various publications in the United States have basically come out saying that Joe Biden was just kind of giving him what he wanted, giving Zelensky what Biden wanted, in order to get what Biden wanted out of the deal, which was not to get into a war with Russia, but to harm Russia. And in that regard, Zelensky was just a mouthpiece. He was an effective tool to get what Biden wanted. Biden was never just going to give Ukraine what he wanted, as is self-evident, because he never did. He gave just enough to keep the war going, but never enough to actually have a chance to make a difference, because Biden did correctly, if you want to be honest, recognize that in the event that Zelensky somehow had a shot at achieving battlefield success and started driving Russia out, then almost certainly we're going to accelerate into nuclear war. We do know for certain, because of what the former CIA director Bill Burns admitted in public last year, that Russia was close to using nuclear weapons in late 2022 because they suspected that they were losing. So Biden, I think, correctly recognized that he's going to give Ukraine some stuff, but not enough to make a difference. Now, as I have argued throughout this, it wouldn't have mattered that Biden could have given him a whole division's worth of equipment that a U.S. division would use, multiple divisions, and it still wouldn't have mattered, because it's the manpower. If you don't know how to use this equipment, it doesn't matter how good it is, you're not going to. So it wouldn't have mattered. But what this really exposes, and how that really plays into what's happening right now, is that Volodymyr Zelensky has essentially been a figurehead. So he wasn't calling any shots before, at least not for the West, not for anything that had any genuine ability to change the outcome of the war. Yet he did call the shots inside of his own country. And as I pointed out many times, he's made some just hideous decisions strategically and operationally. It's kind of ironic, and it would be funny if the cost wasn't in so much blood, that earlier in this war, there was a lot of complaints about Putin and how he was trying to be a battalion commander and was getting too involved in what's going on in the fighting, and it was disastrous, and he was showing how incompetent he was. No one in the West ever did an analysis on what Zelensky did. And as I have talked to you many times and shown very graphically, many of the military decisions that he has made have been just catastrophic for his country, starting in Mariupol. Let's back up. Starting in the fact that he refused to end the war, to prevent the war from happening in December of 2021, actually before that, with the Minsk agreements. But for sure, by December 2021, he had a chance to avoid war. If he had to make just the smallest concessions, he refused to do so. Then in Istanbul, of course, he had a chance to end the war, refused to do it. November 2022, another chance, refused to take it, etc. Then on the battlefield, going back to Mariupol in the early months of the war, instead of fighting what made sense militarily to preserve your force and to preserve your fighting capacity, he took the emotional view that says, no, we're not going to give up anything. So he condemned thousands of his troops to either death or being taken prisoner, because they continued to fight even after they were surrounded and could no longer provide any useful military benefit. And then he repeated that. Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, in the current situation with Toretsk, with Chasiv Yar, all these places. Every time he continued to leave his troops there beyond what was military utility, getting thousands of them killed and thousands more probably taken prisoner over the time. And so all he did was lose troops, never did save the cities. Instead of withdrawing back to positions that were more defensible, he continued to hold those ground and lost both the troops and the territory. So really, you see that where Zelensky does have power, he has had disastrous results for his own people. But now then he's like, okay, here comes President Trump. So I want a seat at this table to decide how it's going to end. Now, on the one hand, that certainly would seem to make sense. He really does have to be at the table to a certain extent, because he's going to have to make decisions for his country and whether it does or continues fighting, or how it achieves an end to the fighting. That's one level. And he's been trying to make his case in many recent television interviews, one of which happened, I believe it was just yesterday, or maybe it was even earlier today. I didn't see the date on this one. But first of all, we're going to take a look at what he says here. He's trying to convince everybody that Putin can make the world feel like it loses, but really he can't.
А Путін може зробити так, що він буде змушувати весь світ відчувати, що вони програли. І це буде реальністю. Тому що можна не перемогти Україну, не перемогти, але можна перемогти весь світ. Показати, що він був правий, яким чином, тобто безкарність. Що з ним знайшли компроміси, тобто це, значить, так можна діяти. І це буде сигналом іншим лідерам великих держав, які про це думають, про те, що зробив Путін з Україною, про це думають, але не змогли ще вирішити, не набрали такої сміливості, щоб це зробити. І я думаю, що це дуже небезпечно, я вважаю, якщо будуть прямі перемовини Америки і Росії про Україну без України. Це дуже небезпечно.
Yeah, well, it is very dangerous, I guess, depending on whose perspective you're looking at. But look, there's a couple things in there he said, which unfortunately, again, don't pass the common sense test and are detached from reality. He says that, Putin can make the world feel like it's losing, and he can't take on, but he said the reality is he can't take Ukraine and he can't fool the whole world. Well, he's not trying to fool anyone. He is graphically showing, Putin is, on the ground, that he continues to take city after city, territory after territory, and kill thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian troops, continuing to move the line further and further to the west. That's not a feeling. That's not an impression. That's a battlefield reality. That's what is happening on the ground. So he's trying to convince people, and I guess if people aren't actually paying attention to what's happening on the ground, the reality, I suppose he might be able to convince somebody, certainly those who are already predisposed to agree with him and to like his position. But anyone who's willing to look at the facts can just see, no, really, you are losing. He is winning on the battlefield, and all the evidence shows that he's going to continue to win, and that there's no prospect for you to get out from under this. That's the reality. So if your opening presupposition is that Putin isn't really winning, and that if all we do is stick together, that'll be bad for him, then you're going to be setting yourself up for disaster. Secondly, he says that, listen, if Ukraine isn't at the table here and it's just Russia and you and the United States, he goes, that's really dangerous, because we don't want them to have a situation to where the Putin gets a negotiated settlement that's favorable to him, because then that will give a signal to other would-be tyrants around the world. We've heard this argument many times. It's raised by a lot in the West often, to even include senior Western leaders of major countries, France, UK, Germany, etc. Only there's no truth to it. And listen, it it sounds good when you say it if you don't think about it. You on the one hand, you're thinking, gosh, if Russia wins here, then China's going to take Taiwan, or other would-be dictators around the world. They'll act on theirs too. No, they won't. Whether Russia succeeds or not doesn't have anything to do with what any other country does. And let me explain to you why that is. Russia has spent 3 years to get to the point that they're at right now. We don't know how much longer this war is going to be over, but there's no evidence it's going to be over in the very near term. Maybe in the medium term, but not the near term. So there's going to continue to be a price. Russia has paid an incredible price for what it's done so far. They have lost at least 100,000 dead, maybe 250,000 more seriously wounded. Those are wounds that are never going to be filled. They've had to completely change their economy. They've had to change the how they do business, where they do business, with whom, which was very disruptive to their country, and it's left them. They've been able to weather the storm, but it's not been without consequences. And going forward, it's going to limit what they can do, because instead of having the whole world to do business with, large portions of the Western world are no longer in that. And so, like, even their oil that they've been selling, it's been below market price for the most part. To get the paths out to India and to China, where they sold the most of their gas and crude oil, they've had to do it at a significantly reduced rate, which otherwise they wouldn't have had to do. They could get market prices for it. And maybe they'll get back to that at some point, but there's been a big cost to that. Any country that would think about going to war would have to calculate, do I have the manpower? And do I have the political will at home? Will they support this? If I have, tens of thousands, scores of thousands of my men killed, can my country survive that? Can my political base endure that? You see, these are the realities. Every country thinking about going to war has to look at those things. It doesn't matter what anybody else had done. So for him to make that claim is spurious, because he's just trying to make something that sounds right, that might make you agree with him that, yeah, that's right. Oh, gosh, we can't let him win. And it doesn't matter what he wants or what anybody else thinks. It only matters what's real. And that is what's real. And when he says it's going to be dangerous, if he's not on the table, well, dangerous for who? Maybe for him it could be, because that means that he's going to be basically just left with instructions at the end by Putin, or maybe even Trump, or possibly both. Here's what we agreed to, and here's what you get. And listen, that's had been going on throughout human history, where the smaller states, especially if they've been used as a cudgel by a more powerful state, once that more powerful state decides that they've gotten all they want out of it, then they're going to make a deal whether the little state wants to do it or not, and they're going to be left with what happens. That's not right in terms of just what's moral, but that's reality. And believe me, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot moral going on with any of these interactions here, and with this war, and with the foolish decisions Zelensky has made militarily and for his own country. He's gotten himself into this position. This is just how hard power politics and global affairs works. And now he's stuck with it, and he's trying to talk his way out of it. I don't think he's going to succeed. Then he says, okay, well, how's about this? Maybe instead of just me trying to weasel my way in between Russia and the United States, it's also Europe, so I can talk Europe into joining us.
Вони нам і допомагають, і ми майбутні члени Європейського Союзу, і війна на європейському континенті, тому це також важливо. І я вважаю, що після нашої розмови з Трампом ми повинні перейти к якомусь формату розмов з русскими. І я би хотів, щоб за столом перемовин були передусім Сполучені Штати Америки, Україна і русські, тому що вони воюють проти нас. Так, і якщо чесно, європейський голос Європейського Союзу повинен також бути. Я вважаю, що це було би...
Oh, well, that's so nice of him to say it's fair that European Union should be at the table here too, but they're not going to be, not the one that matters. They'll eventually be drawn into this because they do have a stake in what's going on. But I assure you that this is ultimately going to depend on the personal interaction between Donald Trump and President Putin. And that's it. It's not going to be Keir Starmer. It's not going to be Olaf Scholz. It's not going to be Emmanuel Macron, Meloni out of Italy. It's not going to be any of those people. It's not going to be Zelensky. They'll be second order effects. They might have a seat at the side of the table. They won't be at the head of the table. They won't be they won't be equal partners by any stretch. They're definitely not. I mean, just gracious. European Union basically does whatever the United States leader tells them to, whether that's Biden or Trump. That's just the way it's always been. And that's the way it currently still is. Nobody is going to buck the United States and have a different place. And so they're not going to have an equal voice. They don't have an equal voice. So there certainly won't be one at this negotiating. And when, Zelensky says, hey, he concedes that, all right, I guess it's okay if Russia's at the table. Well, that's another really gracious concession because you don't have a choice. It doesn't matter what you want them to be. They're not. They're in the dominant position. They're in the dominant position over the United States, whereas Russia and the United States have an equal voice because of military power between the two. What they actually have, the potential combat power and definitely the nuclear weapons, they're still two equals. You're not an equal. And the battlefield dynamics are also not equal. And Russia is in the unequivocal dominant position, even among the United States, because we would have to, if we want to try to compel Russia anything, we would have to risk war with Russia, and we're not going to do that. So really, Putin has all the negotiating positions, and that really raises a question that fundamentally that Zelensky is not answering here. Why does Putin have any incentive to concede anything to the Ukraine side? What leverage does the Ukraine side have? What leverage does the European Union have? What leverage does President Trump have? There's just not any that matters. There's some, again, on the periphery. We're not literally without ability to have some influence here, but it's minimal and it's marginal. It's around the edges only. There's no fundamental power that can fundamentally change the negotiations and cause Putin to have to agree to something he doesn't want to, something that's fundamental to him. But Zelensky came back here and he had one final piece that he said, no, I know what it is. Be cool if we're at the table. Hey, maybe we can have the European Union in it too. But the real answer, the best way to have peace is to have NATO in Ukraine.
Тому НАТО, я вважаю, найдешевші. Що в НАТО з точки зору політики, це прояв сили Сполучених Штатів. Я так вважаю. Не Росії, сигнал, що не Росії вирішувати, хто повинен бути в НАТО, а хто не повинен. А вирішувати Сполученим Штатам Америки. Я вважаю, що це велика перемога для Трампа, для президента Сполучених Штатів, я б так сказав. І для союзників також, але передусім для нього. Тому мені здається, що це переможна стратегія із найдешевих.
So he's repeating there some of the mantra that was said at the beginning, before the war started, by then Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Nobody tells NATO who's going to come into NATO but NATO. Our countries, we decide who's going to be into countries come in, and it's not going to be Russia. That rhetorically worked before. It was always absurd and it led to war. But, to say it now, when we're closing in on the 3-year mark of this war, is beyond absurd. And it just shows you're completely disconnected from reality. Then the fact that you're talking NATO also shows disconnection from reality. He says it's the cheapest cause. Look, the only way that would have possibly had an effect is if Ukraine had already been in NATO in December 2021. So when all these things happened, so that if Russia invaded Ukraine, then they would be, Article 5 and all that. Then there would have been some plausibility that could have prevented the war, or that, in fact, more likely, it would have never gotten to that point, because if NATO had ever issued a military action plan, that's the precursor to joining NATO, prior to 2021, that would have been the cause for war. Russia had always said since 2008 that when the Bucharest summit, when NATO first declared publicly that Ukraine would at some point become a member of NATO, that started a clock. And Putin and Russia officials at various levels made unambiguously clear that was going to result in military conflict if you issued that warning. And so that's what eventually happened. So now, 3 years after war, after Russia has lost 100,000 killed, had to completely redo their orientation of their economy, switch a lot of their domestic economy to large-scale weapons production, ammunition production, all that kind of thing, that they're going to say, okay, we paid all of this price, and at the end, we're going to allow the very thing that we went to war to prevent in the first place. I mean, come on, seriously. What kind of illogic would it take to say that out loud again? And does he think, Zelensky, that by saying that out loud and on these multiple venues, like the one he did yesterday, that Trump is going to listen to him and go, okay, well, hey, if that's the least expensive way to stop this war, sure, why not? I mean, and unless he thinks that Trump is stupid, and you can say a lot of things about Trump, but you can't say he's stupid. He is definitely not stupid. And he's also one that's very sharply focused on the balance sheet. And he's not going to willingly put himself in a position to where he's going to come out on the losing end of a balance sheet. And when Zelensky has the temerity to say the cheapest cost, the cheapest outcome, that's one of the that's the most expensive one for the United States, because that would almost certainly mean there's going to be nuclear war. That would almost certainly open the gates for direct conflict between the United States and Russia if we did that. And I think that the evidence is absolutely clear that would happen. Anyone can see that who's willing to look at what's actually going on the ground. Trump definitely is doing it. He's paying attention, and he is sharply focused on what's good and what's bad. He has a preference for an outcome. He would rather work in a certain direction. But so far, what it's shown is when push comes to shove, and he's forced into a situation where he's either going to have to make a situation worse and lose on the balance sheet from what he has in his hand at the moment, or make a decision to, like a businessman, just say, all right, we're just going to turn off the spigot here. We're just going to cut our losses and stop this bleeding and move on to whatever's next. He's shown conclusively that's the way he thinks. That's the way he acts. So I don't know why anybody should expect anything different. Okay, now it's one thing for Volodymyr Zelensky. He's been disconnected from reality for a long time, and it's his country that's involved here. And look, I do have some empathy for the man, because to act on what is reality is going to be something so horrific that he doesn't appear to have the moral courage to actually stand up to. So he's just putting it off and just pretending things are a different way. It's a different thing, though, if it's the leader of a country who's not at war, and that is Keir Starmer. And just about 2 hours ago, he went on to made a press conference with current NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and Starmer was handed the microphone, and he talked about what he plans on doing with this war from this point at the 3-year mark. Here's where he thinks things should go.
We are all working to end this war, but let's be absolutely clear. Peace will come through strength, and we must do all that we can to support Ukraine's defence. And that means stabilising the front line, providing the kit and training that they need. And that's why this year the UK will give more military support to Ukraine than ever before.
Now, I don't know if this is just rhetorical statements. I don't know if he actually believes this. I'm be more concerned if he actually believes it. He still says, after all that we've seen, after all that we've talked about here on this channel, that you can stabilize the front by giving more stuff. Apparently, he doesn't understand, or else he's just being dishonest. And I don't know which, I can't say, but they're equally bad, and the results is the same. That you think you can stabilize the front by giving more stuff, that means that you don't understand that it's men, not machines, not money, that wins war. And Ukraine doesn't have the manpower. They can't recruit enough. They can't get them well enough trained. And in many places, they actually have had the weapons. They have had the ammunition. There's been some reports that the huge imbalance in artillery ammunition, for example, is now something closer to parity, but it hasn't made any impact on the battlefield because the manpower issue is decisively in Russia's favor. And they still have a majority of firepower that the West will never be able to match. But what is even more concerning is that they also don't have the capacity to man any of this stuff, to use all this ammunition. They just don't have it, and they never will. Now that they're actually thinking about going to the last generation of men, the young men, 18 to 25-year-olds, they're thinking about bringing them. That would just be slaughter. And even if you did it, it's not going to provide enough people, definitely not going to provide enough trained people, and it still won't change the outcome. Because Russia's army is now much, much bigger. And because it's bigger and the way they've chosen to organize is that they have some units that are in combat and conflict for a long time, and when they get to some certain amount of casualties that they've suffered or certain amount of time on the front, they rotate the unit off, refit, reform, retrain, get some rest, etc. Meanwhile, they move another one in so that it's a seamless transition, so the front line remains constant pressure to the west. And what that does is that you can sustain that nearly indefinitely as long as you continue to have people to come in, because they have plenty of time to actually train these folks up and to get them on the front lines. That's how the Russians are operating here. So you aren't going to stabilize the front by giving Ukraine more stuff, because they don't have the capacity to do what the Russians are doing. So they just kill them. They just die in large numbers every time they put them on there if they stay and fight. You've also seen Sersky said they're not mobilizing enough, that the many of the units that they've gone to the front, they've collapsed before they even got there because their people are abandoning the fight and deserting. And then some aren't fighting when they get there. Even if they get to the front line, they're not willing to obey the orders to fight. And so that means more of them die in large numbers, and then they keep getting moved back. You see, this is a debilitating cycle that's spinning down that can only end in one way.
So how are things going? I mean, last time I talked to you was 3 months ago. How is the situation on the front line?
Really, I think situation not really good for me. It's we're all tired. We're all tired. We wanna peace.
We need manpower. We need equipment. The main thing is the abundance of Russian equipment is just too much. There's too many soldiers and stuff.
It's really hard. It's really hard. We don't have enough people.
So what do you want to see happen? Like you say, peace.
I want to be sure about war didn't come in to my home again. Like I want to hear from politics, hear from my president, hear from Trump maybe or somebody else.
Why don't the politicians do their work and sort this thing out? We need Western help for this thing to stop it right here. We do, 110%. If we don't get it, I honestly don't think we're going to be able to hold it for much longer.
Why does no one in the West listen to the men doing the fighting? If you're not going to watch our channel, if you're not going to look at a map, if you're not going to see how it's transpiring, listen to the men doing the fighting and dying. The fact that these are saying it openly and publicly, they're not tiling their faces, they're not using fake names, because they're desperate. They see that if somebody doesn't listen to us, it's just not going to work. We showed you a clip a couple of days ago about one guy who deserted, a Ukraine guy who deserted, who rather would face trial and imprisonment than what he viewed as nearly certain death. And he said, listen, don't worry about me particularly. If you guys don't bring this war to an end, you're going to end up having to mobilize like the police department, the fire department, just the prosecutors, the legal people. Everybody's going to have to go to the war. And then the war is going to be at the front gates of Kiev. That's what he said under oath in his own defense. Why does no one want to listen to these guys? It's like all these people in the West keep thinking that I'll just not hear it. And well, they're just not motivated enough or whatever. But the fact is what it is. You hear what they're saying and you see it's matched up by what you see on the ground. It is real and is moving that direction. So you have so many in the West and in the leadership positions within Ukraine just divorced from reality. And now into this, let's get back now to who is at the table, and that is Trump and Putin, or their lieutenants. It's probably Lavrov on one side and General Kellogg on the other side. Well, Kellogg went on Fox News to try and explain one of the issues that's at play, that apparently the Russians have said, hey, we're not going to talk to Zelensky. We're not going to reach a deal with him because he's an illegitimate president. He went past his term of service. He didn't hold elections, so he's no longer a valid president, so we can't do a deal with him. That's the claim. And so you have Keith Kellogg went on to explain how it's not really that big of a deal.
I think what's happened when you talk about like elections, it's in their constitution. They can't have an election. They're the Ukrainians until the war goes to at least a ceasefire. And long term, they're going to happen. I believe it's happening. But both sides are going to leaders. You're going to deal with Zelensky. You're going to lead with Putin. I know Putin has made the comment, well, he's illegitimate leader. Well, that's not his call. That's the Ukrainians' call. Yeah. But both sides are going to have to give a little bit. And that's the way negotiations work. And I think both sides will give a little bit. Zelensky has already indicated, He's softened his position on land, and Putin's going to have to soften his positions as well. I mean, you just can't be one way or the other. The Western world won't stand for
it. Well, the Western world won't stand for it. All right. Well, let's take a look at some of the things you said there, because some things are just inaccurate, just not true. He says that no, that the Constitution says that they can't hold elections until there's a ceasefire. Of course, the Constitution does. What Constitution is ever going to be written by any country that says, oh, and by the way, in case we're ever invaded and there's a country that's halfway in it, you can't have an election until there's a ceasefire? Obviously, it doesn't say that. It certainly doesn't say that. In fact, it doesn't say anything about that at all. And the only thing it says is there will be an election every, I believe it's 5-year term for them. He was elected in 2019. His term ended in 2024. And now he's just been serving before. And he says, well, we can't, he says, we just can't have it because there's this war going on. We can't have it until there's a ceasefire over. Well, that may be his personal opinion and certainly his preference. But look, during the war, you had Putin, who also his term came to an expire in 2024. They held elections. The United States, in the middle of a civil war, also we had elections that were held. And you had Abraham Lincoln put his name on the line there. Maybe he was going to win, maybe he wouldn't, but that's just what democracy is. And if you're going to be a democracy, civil war, no civil war, you're going to have elections. So there is plenty of precedent, which we certainly have lived in ourselves. And there's also the common sense factor there. So yeah, he's saying that, but that's self-serving. The next thing he says is that, it can't just be one way or the other. She said, Zelensky has softened his view a little bit, but Putin's also going to have to soften his view. It just can't be one way or the other. Yeah, it can. It can. Again, taking what some people think is fair or equitable or right or wrong. Unfortunately, when it comes to this kind of stuff, you can just throw that out the window. Honestly, when it gets to a certain point, even morality, it doesn't play a part. What does play a part is the cold, hard calculations. And the fact is that Russia is winning on the battlefield. And for the reasons I've already told you many times, all of the power dynamics are on their side. Ergo, Putin can just go down the direction that he wants to. He can set the conditions. He can say, we're not going to do a deal with Zelensky, because he has the power to make that happen. President Trump doesn't have the power to force Putin to do that. One of the other comments during that same interview with Zelensky is that he again reiterated something we've said, shown him say on this channel many times, is that he believes that Putin is afraid of Trump, that he believes that Trump has the capacity to force Putin into a negotiated settlement to Kiev's liking. He doesn't. He doesn't. And that's just the truth of it. And in fact, speaking of the issue with the legality of it, here's the way Putin put it just a few days ago.
Zelensky says he's open to negotiations. Do you think it is possible to negotiate with him?
You can negotiate with anyone, but because of his illegality, he, Zelensky, has no right to sign anything. If he wants to take part in the negotiations, I will appoint people to conduct them. But as far as signing documents is concerned, everything should be done in such a way that lawyers confirm to us the legitimacy of those people who will be authorized by the Ukrainian state to sign these agreements.
And he has the capacity to do that. He said, sure, I'll talk to him. So he'll allow him at the table, but he's not going to sign any deal with that. And let me translate to you what that means. We can come to a negotiated settlement. That's what Putin is going to be saying to both Trump and Zelensky. And we'll come to whatever terms we say we've agreed to. And so far, the minimum lines is the June 14 lines, which is the administrative borders of the 4 provinces that he annexed in 2022. That's the entry point for Putin. And if that is not agreed to, then Putin will simply keep fighting. Even if you agreed to that and said, yes, all right, we're just going to agree to the administrative borders. That means that the Ukraine side will withdraw its military forces from all of that territory that are in those the provinces that currently Ukraine still possesses. They'll withdraw from that. Russia can move up to the forward. That's fine. And even in that case, if Ukraine doesn't have a leader that the Russians view as legitimate, they'll keep fighting. So that's going to put pressure politically on Ukraine to either say, we're going to have someone besides Zelensky, and Putin has floated a couple of possibilities. There's some people in the Rada and their parliament that he said these people could, or they'll have to have a snap election, and they'll have to have it so that whoever wins that election and becomes the legitimate president of Ukraine will be able to sign that deal. So there is a time pressure there. Don't miss this. Putin is laying out the conditions right there that we'll get what we want diplomatically. We'll get what we want in negotiated settlement. But if we don't get it in the way we're asking for it, we're going to keep fighting. And you can see, I've shown you before, their Minister of Defense, Belousov, has said, we're prepared to win the war in 2025, even if they have to fight the whole calendar year. They're ready for it. Their industry is ready for it. Their personnel system is ready for it. Their public is ready for it. They're all mentally prepared to continue fighting. They hear all these comments about negotiated settlements, but nobody that I've seen in Russia, and certainly not large percentage, is saying, yes, let's stop the fighting. Let's do a ceasefire and see if we can end it. They're saying, press harder until we get what we need for our national security. And they've invested so much, not just Putin himself, but the people. They've invested so much and sacrificed so many people. They're not going to want the sacrifice and the loss of their loved one to have been in vain, and to leave in place a political entity on the other side that could, if it's connected to NATO, just start back and go to war again and bring NATO into the border again with Russia. No, even if it's the new administrative border, it's still NATO on the border if they let it come in. They have the power to refuse that, to make it not work out. And it's starting to look to me that Trump, I think, understands this. Here's what he said a few days ago about how he wants to end the war.
On your call with Vladimir Putin.
Well, we'll be speaking. We'll be speaking, and I think we'll perhaps do something that'll be significant. We want to end that war. That war would have never started if I was president, and we want to end that war. That war is a horrible war. It's got to stop. So whatever I can do to stop it, and we are having discussions, yes.
Ongoing, already scheduled, and ongoing?
Already talking, yes.
So you've already spoken to Vladimir Putin?
I don't want to say that, but we are having very serious discussions.
Is there a reason you don't want to?
We are. Well, I just don't want to say that. We're having very serious discussions about that war, trying to get it ended.
With Russia?
With Russia, yeah.
Now, that was a few days ago. Actually, earlier today, I've mentioned that General Keith Kellogg is the envoy, Trump's envoy for these discussions. That was apparently only made official today. And at the signing of that document, he added a little bit more.
Next, we have retired General Keith Kellogg to be your special envoy on Russian-Ukraine issues.
We've made a lot of progress on Russia, Ukraine. We'll see what happens, but a lot of progress has been made. We got to stop that ridiculous war.
Okay, you see there in both of those clips where Trump has said they're already talking with Russia. Ergo, who's not at the seat? Who doesn't have a seat at that negotiating table so far? It's Trump's. It's Zelensky who's the man on the out, which is probably why he's making those interviews, trying to get inside. But he's not going to. You also hear Trump in that last one, literally hours ago, saying, we need to get this ridiculous war over with. And in the previous one, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get this war over with. This is not a war that's on priority for Trump. He doesn't need to win this. It wasn't a war of his choosing. He didn't support it. It was Biden's initiative. Biden's the one that supported it. He encouraged the Ukrainians to fight it. He continued to support them. Trump has stopped all that. So far, according to what we see, at least no new aid has been going out the door, and they're actually questioning whether they're going to continue to give them other aid. That's where he's at right now. So there should be signals received by not just Zelensky, but by Keir Starmer and several of these other people that Trump is not in any interest, doesn't have any interest in perpetuating a losing prospect. And the fact that he's already talking to Russia at the highest levels, and now he officially has Kellogg on board, hopefully very soon that we'll actually see some formal talks going on between Kellogg and probably Lavrov or whoever else the Russians choose to on their side. And then at some point, Zelensky will be brought in. Probably we'll also see in the near future that Kellogg will go to Kiev, and I'm sure he'll confer with Zelensky and his team and all that. And then there will be more coming out of there. But don't let the theater of that change, blind you to what's going on. This war is going to be brought to an end. It's not going to be like Keir Starmer says, where they're going to stabilize the front line, because it can't be done. Trump is going to say, whatever we need to do to get this off the table, because it's a distraction for Trump. He has a big agenda domestically, things that he wants to get done. He wants to focus in his energy and his money to go to those places, and he doesn't want it going distracted on something that he doesn't even care about in Ukraine. And I think it's very clear that Trump understands NATO is still there. NATO hasn't been diminished. It's still fully intact. Nobody has been attacked on the NATO side. Nobody needs to be attacked. There doesn't need to be any escalation of the war there. And as long as Putin stops at the administrative borders of that, what he's agreed to, or whatever the terms are, maybe there's even more than that, I don't know. But as long as Putin abides by whatever he agrees to with Trump, then that war can be over and the killing can stop, and there doesn't need to be any more, doesn't need to be any expansion. Nobody else has to be at risk. But this is careful. This is what Kellogg needs to understand. This is what President Trump needs to understand. Zelensky, everybody in the West. If we don't agree to a negotiated settlement that gets this over quickly, Russia will keep fighting. No one should be confused on this point or surprised by it. And we don't need, and if you let them continue gaining enough, there may come a point to where they say, we're not even interested in talking anymore. No one's going to be willing to negotiate on the Western side. So we're just going to military go forward until we conquer what we want, and then we'll tell you what the terms are afterwards. And we don't know how far that could be. If you push Russia into a point to where it gets to that point, they definitely may not stop at the administrative borders of the 4 oblasts. They could well go all the way to the Dnieper River, and then that would, by geography, put them potentially right up to the gates of Kiev. And we don't even know, we don't even want to imagine what may happen to that. How many other tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people would be killed in between now and then if it goes that direction, and it's still not going to change the outcome. That's what you need to understand. If it goes that direction, there will still be the Russian militarily have conquered these territories, except now that it's going to be all on Russia's terms. This is the one point of leverage that the Trump administration does have. If they take this action here and reach negotiated settlement on whatever terms they can get in the present time, while even all of the 4 oblasts are not all under Russian control, they can limit what Russia's going to do, bring peace and stability to the rest of Europe, and allow the Ukraine side, what's left of it, to finally start to rebuild and to have a chance to knock out a future for itself. That's the best case scenario. That's what Trump has the power to do and can do in the near term. It remains to be seen whether he's going to go down that path, but no matter what path he chooses, there's no pushing Russia back. They have a lot now, and they could get even more if it goes that direction. We'll have to wait and see how it works out. But in the meantime, we thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to see you on a Monday. And we're going to have some, we'll talk about it here later, but we have some great guests tomorrow. Well, I guess we'll talk about this one right now. Colonel McGregor has been confirmed, and he'll be on at noon tomorrow. And he's got a lot of interesting things. Also, I think Gary previewed last Saturday, I think it was, Benjamin Netanyahu is in town and is going to probably be making some kind of a statement with Trump at some point. I think there's actually a meeting planned at the White House tomorrow. Later in the afternoon, we're going to have Ambassador Chaz Freeman on to help us interpret whatever comes out of that, whatever statements are said. So we got some great stuff coming for you tomorrow, and as always, during the rest of the week. And if anything happens, you can turn right here, because we will give you the no kidding, here's what's really going on scoop when it happens. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.